I'm going to talk to you, all of you, a little bit about the topic of neurotheology, what it is and how it relates to the field of studying consciousness, and talk a little bit about some of our latest findings, and really just kind of give an overall framework for understanding what this relationship might be, and how studying neurotheology in the context of consciousness might be helpful. For me, neurotheology, I'm not sure how many of you have heard this term. I guess it has been kind of an emerging concept, and for better or for worse, it seems to be the term that is kind of sticking around. It basically refers to the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves. And I think, a couple of important points about that are that, that for me, neurotheology, one, is a two-way street. And what I mean by that is that it is not just the science of religion and spirituality. It is not religion and spirituality talking about science, but really the two sides of who we are as human beings, the spiritual and the and religious on one hand, and the science and technological on the other, kind of looking at each other and trying to help us figure out who we are and how we relate to the world. So that to me is a very important point. And then the other piece to this is that I think for neurotheology as a concept to work as a field, that the neuro and the theology side have to be defined pretty broadly. So the neuro, as we'll talk about, includes things like neurology, neuroimaging, neuroscience, and so forth. But it also includes psychology, it includes anthropology, sociology, perhaps. All the ways we kind of get at how we are physiologically and how we use our brain in the context of our lives and in our thought processes and experiences. And then on the other side, the theology side, theology, of course, is a specific tradition, a specific approach to looking at a given tradition that is very analytical. But I think for, we can look at theological concepts and problems, but there's also the philosophical ideas. And of course, there's all different aspects of spiritual experiences, practices, beliefs, and so forth. So if we kind of expand both of these sides up in terms of what neurotheology is, then we get into an ability to really explore all the different possibilities in terms of understanding who we are as human beings. And of course, consciousness itself becomes a fundamentally important concept with regard to neurotheology, because consciousness itself is affected very deeply in a lot of experiences that are referred to as religious and spiritual. So there's an interesting overlap there. And that's really what I wanted to kind of focus on. And again, kind of introduce everyone to what these concepts are about, and perhaps open up some ideas in your own mind about, how you might begin to think about the areas or the issues that you in particular are exploring on your own, or in your own work, or in your own research and scholarship, to think a little bit about what the brain is doing in this context. So, I mean, obviously, I sort of felt obligated to throw in a little brief discussion of consciousness. I mean, obviously, you all know what consciousness is, so I will skip over that. This is a table that, or a figure that came out of a book that we published called How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, where we do talk about kind of the different aspects of consciousness and awareness, all the way from just kind of the basic awareness that we have of the world, which might be considered some type of instinctual or habitual awareness, to the transformational awareness, which I'm sure many of you are that's where you are in terms of thinking about things and trying to understand it. So this to me was kind of an important slide, I think, for the presentation today, and to jump to it. In the context of neurotheology, the study of consciousness, there are many different ways of thinking about this, and certainly we can study those individuals who are religious or spiritual. We can do this in a number of ways. We can look at individual practices like meditation or prayer practices or other types of spiritual practices that induce altered states of consciousness, and try to understand how they work, what they're doing, and how they're doing things physiologically as well as subjectively to the consciousness itself. Of course, there are some of the more intense experiences, mystical experiences, that could also be looked at, because these represent a more dramatic change in a person's consciousness. Psychedelic experiences, I mean, obviously the psychedelic world certainly has something to do with the world of psychiatry and psychology, But so many of these psychedelic compounds have been used for thousands of years by shamanic cultures as ways of inducing altered states of consciousness and spiritual states for people. These provide a very unique opportunity to explore the physiology as well, because we know where a lot of these compounds go. We know that compounds such as psilocybin will go to the serotonin system. We know that we know that cocaine and methamphetamines go to the dopaminergic system. So these things that induce alterations in consciousness, how they alter consciousness in different ways, can be very valuable. Near-death experiences, again, a really fascinating area that kind of, it can be a part of neurotheology because of the religious and spiritual element of it. It can be part of the psychological or psychiatric aspect, and even the medical aspect, because obviously these occur in the near-death state. And of course, there's some, I can do a whole series of lectures on what near-death experiences are and how they operate and work and what we know about them and all that. But suffice it to say here that these are interesting areas of overlap between neurotheology and the study of consciousness. And expanding that a little bit, we can look at consciousness in other people, and that can be, again, the study of altered states using things like neuroimaging, neurological disorders. And this is an interesting area of research, because what you're saying is that can we see what happens to consciousness as we remove things, as we damage things in the brain, and how does that change a person's sense of consciousness, or even psychiatric disorders like dissociative states or schizophrenia, which are clearly associated with very unusual consciousness-related experiences. Part of what I've been fascinated with, and part of my own journey has always been my own personal reflection on myself, on my own consciousness. So taking an inward look through introspection and contemplative processes in and of itself for you as an individual can be helpful. And then there are even other interesting possibilities of exploring consciousness or even spirituality and various rituals and so forth in animals. And of course, there's a very large area of exploration in the field of computer sciences and artificial intelligence. In terms of the personal or the subjective aspects of the experience, how do we explore our own consciousness, and can we combine, could I do a brain scan study of my own consciousness and what happens when I try to drive myself out of my quote unquote normal state of consciousness, perhaps into a some type of mystical experience or spiritual experience? Can we look at individuals who are able to do that? Can we look at different meditation techniques and explore the altered states of consciousness and what's going on physiologically? Brain imaging, changes to the autonomic nervous system, changes in other physiological processes of the body. How can we look at, again, other types of states within the person? And so in my own research, we recognize that not only can we, is it important to look at the brain itself, but it is important to understand what the person is actually experiencing. And so we've been doing a lot more qualitative data to be able to understand the nature of these spiritual experiences. I'm going to share a little bit of that with you shortly. And even, and other ways of stimulating the brain, whether it's through psychedelics, whether it's through things like transcranial magnetic stimulation or other types of brain stimulation approaches. So, to me, the sky's really the limit. It's a very exciting time right now because we have so many ways of exploring the relationship between consciousness and the brain and how that intersects with various religious and spiritual contexts. Neuroimaging studies, this is a big area of my own personal research. I've been involved in studying a variety of brain-related states, both pathological as well as normal, so to speak. Pathological states can include things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, depression, and so forth, as well as a variety of mental states that are just related to how we view the world, all the way up to various religious and spiritual states that can be looking at people speaking in tongues, for example, we did a study on, or people who are engaged in very deep prayer practices. People, we did a study of Brazilian mediums and what goes on in their brain when they enter a trance state and try to connect with the spirit world. So, there's just so many fascinating possibilities. And as I kind of mentioned at the very outset, in terms of the context of what neurotheology is about, very important, I think, for all of us to recognize that we have to be careful about whatever conclusions that we make. So, for example, if we study the Brazilian mediums and we see changes in their brain, this doesn't, it means that there's something going on in their brain when they are engaged in this kind of practice and having this kind of an experience. But it doesn't mean that the experience is reducible to the brain. It doesn't mean that the brain is inherently just along for the ride. It means that we're seeing changes, and we need to better understand what that relationship is. The better we can design studies, perhaps we can start to draw some causal arrows if we're very, very careful. But again, we have to be very cautious about where we go with interpreting the results of these studies, because so often people either take them right away to say, oh, this proves that the spiritual state exists, or oh, this proves that the spiritual state is nothing but the brain's functions. To me, it is an exploration, and it is something that we need to continue to look at. And in the context of consciousness, again, I think we can look at the neurophysiological correlates of consciousness, but we have to really think hard about how we might design a study to capture that moment where consciousness is. I always challenge my students about, in the brain, there's electrical changes, and there's sodium and potassium crossing the neuronal membrane, and there's depolarizations occurring in the axons, and there's neurotransmitters of dopamine and serotonin being released, and there's nerve cells that are activated and deactivated. Kind of like where in all of that is our consciousness, if at all, and how do we understand that? Where are our thought processes in that? Where are our emotions? Or is it, as many people think, that consciousness is something that goes far beyond the brain, that the brain has a way of tapping into? But then again, what does that mean? If we're tapping into some universal consciousness, how does that happen? And what's going on in the physiology of our brain that enables us to have different kinds of experiences? So I do want to share very briefly some of the core components of the spiritual transformation experience. These are Enlightenment experiences. Certainly they are described as altered states of consciousness, so there can be different terms that could be used. Here I've used the term spiritual transformation. They can be called Enlightenment, awakening experiences, mystical experiences for people. So lots of different terms, which in and of itself is a fascinating issue for us to address. But we did a study, as I mentioned, we've been looking more and more at the qualitative aspects of these experiences. And when we get narrative descriptions of these experiences, and we've gotten over 2,000 of them, we can distill them out. We can do something called content analysis and see what terms, what words, what concepts are used as part of these descriptions. And we divided the core components into these 5 elements: the feeling of intensity, clarity, unity, surrender, and the permanence of the transformation. So what I mean by this, here's a couple of quick quotes for you. This was a description of the intensity of the experience in a 43-year-old male who said, "I, as an unnameable but individual being, was traveling down an infinite roller coaster like waves of pure white ecstatic light. The ecstasy was overwhelming and rose and fell in intensity with the waves of light. The light path seemed infinitely long in both directions. The sense of the being and the light was infinitely more real than anything I had ever experienced." And those capitals were provided by the individual, not by me. So, again, we're seeing all these terms here that talk about the intensity of the experience. It's pure, it's overwhelming, it's ecstatic, it's infinite. So, all of these things are going on, which is part of what denotes this state of consciousness as fundamentally distinct from our everyday perspectives of consciousness. And part of what we've seen here are changes in an area of the brain that are referred to as the limbic system, the main emotional centers of the brain, that do turn on when anything of motivational importance enters into our sensory environment. So the limbic system kind of tells us what's important and helps us to feel that it's important. And what you're looking at here is a SPECT scan that is looking at blood flow changes in the brain during a practice of meditation. The way to look at this is the colors represent the amount of activity. So red is more than yellow, more than blue and black. And where the arrow is pointing really right at the limbic system. So this is the person's brain at rest. and then we capture their brain during the meditation practice, this very deep spiritual state, you can see there's very intense activity in this red area, very intense red activity. And this is exactly where the limbic system is. So these are areas such as the amygdala and the hippocampus that light up to signify that this is a very important, very intense experience for the individual. Now, here is a description of an experience of clarity from a 37-year-old female scientist. She said, everything in life seemed to click. I had this clarity, and it was as if I was looking at life from the inside out. Despite my trepidation, this experience seemed to satisfy my proof-oriented mentality with the concept of intuition. It was almost as if my intuition from somewhere deeper had offered up some sort of direct evidence that offered up a proof. So there's a sense of clarity, a sense that people understand the world in a different way than they ever have before. And part of where we think that this might be engaged with in terms of the brain is a very central structure called the thalamus, where the arrow is. You can see here in the resting state that that both sides of the thalamus are fairly equivalent. But when the person is engaged in a deep spiritual practice or experience, we see a shift in the activity in the thalamus. Well, as you can see, it's a very central structure, so it helps different parts of the brain to connect with each other. It brings up a lot of our sensory information into the brain. And so, it's not surprising, I think, that alterations in thalamic activity would be associated with a whole different perspective on what our reality is about, the clarity with which we understand that reality. And some people have certainly, thought about the thalamus as being a very fundamental area of the brain for consciousness itself. Feelings of unity and oneness are another part of the experience. Feeling that people feel a sense of being connected to the infinite cosmos, to God, to infinite consciousness, a oneness of all things, obviously a very well-known concept. And we think that part of what we see here on brain scans are areas of the parietal lobe that actually start to quiet down. So here's the resting state again, and then here is what's going on during the meditation state. So we can see that their parietal lobe decreases. It's now all in yellows. And this is an area of our brain that normally helps us to create our spatial representation of the self. So a decrease of activity in that area would be associated with a loss of that sense of self, a blurring of the boundaries between the self and the rest of the world, and that feeling of oneness or unity. So we can start to see what these physiological processes may be, but it is, again, it's challenging to understand whether this is along for the ride or causing the experience. So, a lot of really fascinating questions for us to think about. The last part, in the moment of the experience is this feeling of surrender, that the person is kind of along for the ride, if you will, and they just kind of give themselves over to it. So here is a description of a 48-year-old Catholic woman who said, I surrendered everything, including my faith, my salvation, and only for one reason. I love God so much that I would truly give up everything to be connected with God. I said yes, and in an instant, God returned everything to me transformed. From that day forward, a new relationship exists between God and me, which is ever present, no distance, no separation. I am not attached to doctrine, dogmas, or rituals. I see God's actions all around me. So what we're seeing here is a sense of surrendering oneself, allowing oneself to just be sort of taken into this process. And this seems to be associated with changes in the frontal lobe. So this is where these arrows are pointing right now. That when a person is in kind of a regular state, their frontal lobes are on, paying attention to what's going on around them. But when they engage in these practices, these frontal lobes actually can quiet down. You can see the red areas here start to become much less active. They're more in the greens, for example. And the frontal lobe normally helps us to focus our mind, to focus our attention. So when it shuts down, we lose that concentration, we lose that sense of purposefulness, and we feel as if we have kind of given over our willfulness to the experience itself. These experiences result in substantial transformations. So these altered states of consciousness come back within our everyday reality, our everyday perspective of consciousness, to change the way we think about our relationships, the way we think about death, life, meaning and purpose, and even our religious and spiritual perspectives, almost always for the better. Now, there is a small percentage of people who describe things getting worse as the result of these experiences. And that in and of itself is an important part of neurotheology, which is to explore both the good and the bad. And so sometimes these experiences can go awry. You can talk about Kundalini experiences, for example, that where people are not prepared for them and can create great problems for them. So we need to understand that. We need to understand, are there predisposing factors that would lead someone to a more negative experience? What goes on during these experiences that leads to something more problematic? So again, from a psychiatric or psychological perspective, very important for us to think about where are the areas of both, the benefits that people attain, as well as what happens when things go wrong and how we can help people to avoid that. I mentioned this earlier, and I'm running out of time, so I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but certainly looking at neurological patients, people who have head injury, strokes, tumors, and so forth, these can change consciousness in different ways. And studying that and relating it to what we see in the brain scan studies could be very interesting and very helpful. Where consciousness is located in the brain, or how the brain somehow connects to consciousness, the short answer is we have no idea. And even though many different areas of the brain have been proposed to be the seat of consciousness, there are so many studies that have shown that as you slice up the brain, people can still maintain their level of consciousness in so many different ways. So, all of this kind of research will be very helpful for us to think about as we go forward in the field of neurotheology and the field of consciousness studies, looking at what is essentially the most mysterious aspect of us as human beings. We all have it, but scientifically it becomes very hard to prove. And looking at these different spiritual states, spiritual practices like meditation, understanding their physiology, looking at what's going on in the brain, looking at what's going on at the level of neurotransmitters, I think can just provide a tremendous amount of new information that helps to facilitate and advance our discussions about what consciousness is, how it relates to us as human beings, how it might be useful in the context of psychiatry and psychology. So, again, the sky's the limit. It's very exciting. And that's why I was excited to be able to share some of this information with you. If any of you are interested in exploring neurotheology itself and these discussions about consciousness, I've been very fortunate to publish a number of different books looking at these relationships. And obviously in a half hour, it's very difficult to explain any little point, let alone the whole thing. So there's so much for us to learn, and it's a very exciting area to be able to explore. And I thank you very much for your time.